For those who don't know me, I'm Victor. My pronouns are he, she, they. I am a software engineer at Microsoft. I'm also co-leader for Gleam Vancouver. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we here in Vancouver are gathered in unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we would like to acknowledge our traditional hosts, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to gather here to learn and work and try to be better humans. Our silence and our ignorance actually promotes prejudice. And the same thing has happened for the Trans Plus movement. In recent events, we can see that their livelihood are being prosecuted. First is in the United Kingdom. They have announced the intention to not support gender self-determination. And they also have withdrawn access to healthcare for minors in matters of gender-affirming healthcare. United States, they have revoked protection against discrimination in healthcare for trans people, and they will only refer to biological sex as a protected ground. In Hungary, they have outlawed legal gender recognition for trans people, and that basically denies people to have their gender legally recognized. According to the Trans Murder Monitoring Project, from January 1st, 2008 to September 13th, 2019, 3,314 trans plus people were murdered across all continents in the planet. 1,252 were shot, 653 were stabbed, and 334 were beaten. All these types of crime, they are a sign of hate in the end. When we hear those things, it's a call out for us to learn and educate ourselves, and mostly to act in defense of these lives. Why not approach this by speaking about this culture and its community? We have brought two people here. First is my awesome coworker, Claudia. She will be a moderator today. She's the product manager of Office Media Group, and she's also an active member of Gleam Vancouver. In the other side, our speaker is Aaron. Aaron has a lot of accomplishments, so I actually have a list here because it's too much for a person to remember. But he's a PhD studying and teaching transgender topics since the 1980s. He has established, holds the world's first chair of transgender studies. He has founded and still hosts the international and interdisciplinary conference called Moving Trans History Forward. He has also founded and he's the academic director of the world's largest transgender archives. He's also going to talk about all this. He's an award-winning professor known nationally and internationally. I hope we have a great conversation here.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for kicking us off. And hello, everyone. Today, I'll be moderating our Q&A session on behalf of Gleam Vancouver, and I'll pass it off to Aaron now.
Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. I feel very well recognized and appreciated. And so I would like to start off with some appreciations of my own, because I'm not in Vancouver. I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, actually from the University of Victoria, which is on the Lekwungen traditional territory, and more specifically the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. So I thank them for allowing us to live here and to thrive in those traditional territories. I'd like to start by telling you a bit more about the Chair in Transgender Studies and some of what we do. So thank you, Victor, for bringing a little bit of that to the front. So the Chair in Transgender Studies started, I founded it, it started in 2016 at the University of Victoria. At the time, it was the only chair in transgender studies in the world. There is now one, I'm happy to say, also in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So no longer the first. The chair is a privately funded, although it does reside at the University of Victoria with all sorts of in-kind supports from the University of Victoria. It has two really large components to it. One I've got up on the screen right now, which is the Moving Trans History Forward conferences, which I also started. The first conference was in 2014, prior to the establishment of the chair, although the chair runs them now. These are international and interdisciplinary, and they have been growing every time we do them. We do them every 2 years. So in 2014, we had 85 people. In 2016, we had 150. In 2018, we had 300, and we were planning on having a conference in 2020 and expecting 500 people at that one. COVID happened, and so we have postponed to 2021, and we will be doing that one online. So please stay tuned for more information about that. I want to emphasize these conferences are not only interdisciplinary, but they are also 50% community-based and 50% academic. So this is a conference for everyone from your trans person on the street, their family members, service providers, and academics and students, and all government officials, policymakers, all manner of people. And we draw people of all gender identities and all other kinds of variety and diversity. The other big thing we do is the Transgender Archives. I'm going to spend a few minutes on that on a slide coming up, but I also want to mention some of the other things we do. We have a scholarships and fellowships program, scholarships for UVic students, fellowships for people who come from away, and those are for both people who identify as somewhere on the trans spectrum and also for people who have any identity and are interested in studying transgender topics. We bring in visiting scholars from around the world who stay for different lengths of time, from 1 month to 1 year. We have a lecture series. We do arts and cultural events. So, for instance, we've had put on a couple of art shows, and we've had in a dance troupe and spoken word artists. We do a lot of public education. I go out and do talks to anything from church groups to 750 chiefs of police. Do lots of media talking with radio, TV, video, podcasts, this kind of thing. We've got a social media presence. At the end, I'll put up our links for that. Train graduate students, teach undergraduate and graduate courses, advise governments and agencies and schools and businesses on policy, and do all sorts of interesting research projects. Just to mention a few right now, I'm working on one on electronic health records, oral histories for trans people, and employment prospects for trans people. So it's a quick overview of the chair. I want to take a couple of minutes to tell you a bit also about the Transgender Archives, which is the other big thing that we do. I founded the Transgender Archives. We officially launched at the end of 2011, so that predates both of the other two I just mentioned. They're now part of the Chair in Transgender Studies. Transgender Archives are an integrated part of the University of Victoria Libraries, are owned and managed by the University of Victoria Libraries. When archivists try and tell you how big is an archives, what they do is they say, well, if we took all the books and all the boxes that we keep things in and all the other miscellaneous items and we put them on one big long shelf, how long would that shelf be? So when I say it's the largest transgender archives in the world, I'm willing to bet that what you imagine is a lot smaller than what we have, because if you put all of that on the shelf, it would be a football field and a half long, that shelf. We have material from 23 countries in 18 languages. Those countries are on every continent except Antarctica, and the collections go back to the end of the 19th century. It has a focus on activism and research. We've got books, magazines, newsletters, newspaper clipping files, photographs, audio and video materials, records from organizations, personal stories, legal cases, works of art, and interesting little things like you see on the screen now, buttons and boots. It's free. It's open to the public. Lots of it is online. We're bringing in more all the time. We're putting more online all the time. And we have a partner called the Digital Transgender Archives, where if we don't have it online, they have it online from somewhere else as well. So I invite everybody, when you can, when COVID allows it, to come and visit the archives and put your hands on your history.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you, Aaron. That's a whole football field. You can really see the depth of knowledge that's within these archives here. I hope this is a good time to interject, but would love to bring up some frequently asked questions on this topic to frame and kick off our presentation and our talk today. So let's get started with what is non-binary and how many trans people are there?
Sure. So I'm going to start with how many trans people are there, because non-binary is kind of included in that. So when we do surveys, there's been some good surveys done in the US and in Canada. We're getting fairly consistent results that the people who identify anywhere on the spectrum, and I'm going to come to the non-binary part of that in a moment, of trans, are 1 to 2% of the population. So again, that's more than most people would think, because most people are thinking about the people who are obviously trans to them, and lots of folks are not obviously trans. So that includes anybody who identifies their gender as differently from what you would expect based on what they were assigned at the time that they were born. Right. And so included in that are people who they haven't done anything about it, they just think about it, people who have done anything that medicine and social changes would allow of them, and all manner of people in between. And somewhere in there are people who call themselves non-binary. And what they're referring to is that typically we think of sex and gender in a binary way, meaning two. There's males and there's females, or there's men and there's women. And lots of trans people identify as one or the other, but some people identify themselves as non-binary, meaning that they don't fit into men or women, or maybe that they mix it up in interesting ways and they're fluid and they change back and forth, or they combine them in interesting ways. And some people who are non-binary don't feel that trans actually applies to them, because they feel like they're outside of that binary way of thinking about things. And to them, trans says, well, you're going from one piece of the binary to another. And so some non-binary people will say, yes, I'm trans. Some will say I'm gender fluid and that doesn't apply to me. And some will say I'm gender fluid. It does apply to me. But when I give you 1 to 2%, that estimate is including all of those folks.
Thanks for that context there. And there's definitely a lot of nuances to it as well.
Great. So thanks for the question. It's a great question. So I'm going to now take us through some key figures in the history of trans activism, a little bit about trans research. This is by no means comprehensive. There's so many people I could have chosen from. So these are just some folks that I decided to emphasize or to highlight for you. So the first that I'd like to talk about is Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld was a researcher in Berlin, and he was the first person to publish and talk publicly about people called trans something. And so in 1910, he published a book called Transvestites. And he was using that term much more broadly than it has been used in recent years. And it really meant anyone who wore clothing of a sex that was not what was expected of them based on their genitals. And in that period of time, people adopted that language quite quickly and identified themselves as transvestites. People of both of the binary sexes would do that. They even had magazines that were published in the 1920s and 1930s in Berlin. Magnus Hirschfeld started the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. It ran from 1919 to 1933. And that institute was the place where some of the very first gender-affirming surgeries were ever done. And so the very first that we know of was someone named Dorchen Richter. The one that's more famous, some of you will have seen the movie, The Danish Girl, which was about Lily Elbe, and Lily Elbe was at Magnus Hirschfeld's institute, and that's where her surgeries were done. Now, the 20s and 30s were a time where there was a lot of sexual freedom in Berlin, but then the Nazis came to power. And if you have seen black and white photographs of huge piles of books being burned by the Nazis in Berlin, those were Magnus Hirschfeld's books. His institute was one of the first places they raided. They took all of his books and his papers, they brought them into a main plaza and set them on fire. He was on a world speaking tour. He did not come back. And this photograph shows him with his lover, Tao Li, who he met and started a relationship with in Hong Kong as part of that speaking tour. And part of the reason I put this photograph up in particular is that after Magnus Hirschfeld died, Tao Li was quite a bit younger, as you can see, and went on with his life. And in 1975, Tao Li moved to Vancouver. And in 1993, when he died in Vancouver at age 87, someone came to empty his apartment after his death, and the incoming tenant was intrigued by this unusual assortment of quote unquote junk that was piled up for disposal, to take away and throw in the trash. But among that were papers and diaries and photographs, and actually a plaster cast of Hirschfeld's face, which was commonly done, and some notes for a book about Tao Li's life and his travels with Hirschfeld. These were the last bits of Hirschfeld's life that were ever found, because the Nazis destroyed everything they possibly could, and these things only survived because they were with Tao Li, first in Hong Kong and then later in Vancouver, and they are now in the Magnus Hirschfeld archives in Berlin.
Wow, that's great to hear the story, how far-reaching and how international everything went. Wanted to inject here with a question from the audience. Aaron, can you explain more about what you mean when you say the spectrum?
Right. So I'm really just talking about the fact that there is a range of many identities that people have. Some people, when they hear the spectrum, they think of autism spectrum. That's not what I meant at all. I meant the kind of more broad meaning of the word spectrum. It's just that there's a wide range of different identities that people might have that would go under an umbrella. So trans is kind of an umbrella term. Sometimes I say trans plus to try and indicate that there is a wide range, just like we sometimes see LGBTQ2 plus to emphasize that there's lots more, but we can't. It takes too long to say everybody, and you never will actually say everybody's identities because there are so many. Next person I'd like to talk a little bit about is Virginia Prince. You can see the dates up on the screen. Born in 1912, died in 2009. Virginia Prince was one of the very first activists after the activism that I described in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s that was closed down by the Nazis. The next time people who identify themselves as some kind of trans came forward as trans people to advocate on behalf of themselves was in the United States in the very end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. And Virginia Prince was among those very first people. She was active right up into the 2000s, and if you do the math, that means into her 90s. And she started in 1960 a magazine called Transvestia, a play on the word transvestite. It ran for 111 issues until 1986. Transgender Archives has all 111 issues. We have recently digitized them and put them all up online. So if you're interested, you can have a look at those. COVID won't get in your way for that. In 1961, she was arrested, and convicted of sending obscene materials through the U.S. postal system. There was a law against that, and what was considered obscene then would not have even raised an eyebrow now. She wrote a private letter to another private individual talking about some sex that she'd like to have with them. And the other individual was being surveilled, and they were both arrested, and she was convicted. Now, at this time, wearing the clothing that was not considered socially acceptable for the sex you were assigned at birth was, it's against the law to cross-dress. And so she was already a lifelong cross-dresser. And when she was convicted of this crime, she was, you can see that she's white. She was also middle class. Her dad was a doctor. She had a PhD. She had a lot of privileges and advantages. And so she was able to get herself relieved of the obligation of going to jail, but she was on probation. And if she cross-dressed while on probation, which is against the law, she would go to jail. So her lawyer cut a deal for her, which was that she was permitted to cross-dress for educational purposes. And so this started her career as a public speaker on behalf of trans people, and in particular on behalf of cross-dressers or transvestites, as she called herself, and people often called themselves at that time. So she started this career going around to Lions clubs and church basements and public places and speaking on behalf of trans people. In 1968, she went full-time and lived as a woman from then until the end of her life. And she tried to come up with a term to describe who she was and what she was doing, because at the time, the only terms that were in common usage were transvestite, which was someone who was part-time in their gender, in their gender that they felt, and transsexuals who were full-time and including genital surgery. Virginia was never interested in genital surgery. In fact, she spoke out against it. I speak of her by her first name because I knew her personally. She spoke out against it. And she wanted to distinguish herself from transvestites and transsexuals. So she is the person who invented the term transgenderist to describe who she was. And many people will say that is the source of the word transgender today. Virginia actually objected to the way people use her word, that she said they stole it and they're using it wrong. But nonetheless, many people will say that's where it came from, is from her. She's also well known for having once said that sex is between the legs and gender is between the ears. And lots of people still use that phrase, and it was very important because she was saying this in the 70s, at a time when very few people were clear about making any distinction between gender and sex. And that made it easy for people to understand the difference between the two. So very important organizer in the early days. By the time she died in the 2000s, she hadn't changed many of her ideas and the world had moved on. And so she wasn't so popular at the end of her life as she was earlier, but she did really a lot for the community in the 60s and the 70s and moving into the 80s as well.
Aaron, a question here. You mentioned the topic of surgery. So can you explain further, why do some folks choose to have surgery and some do not?
So another good question. Thank you. People's gender identities, coming back to your earlier question about spectrum or range or diversity, people have a diversity of gender identities. And so for some people, the expression of their gender identity absolutely requires that they have genital surgery and that everything about them looks like kind of standard issue male or female as much as is possible. But for lots of people, that's not the case. Lots of people, their gender identity is somewhere in between, and having a body that has different kinds of combinations than is typically expected is exactly the right gender expression for them. There are other people who would like to get more surgery done or have more medical treatment, medical interventions. They're simply unable to for medical reasons or for financial reasons or just access reasons. So there's a variety of reasons why people get surgery or don't get surgery. But the strongest reason really is that people's gender identities are diverse, and people increasingly feel that they should have the right to have bodies that represent their gender identities appropriately. Virginia was way ahead of her time in making that argument. There were very, very few people made that argument then, and she said this kind of configuration expressed who she was precisely. The next person I'd like to talk about is Reed Erickson. Reed Erickson was originally from Philadelphia, and then his family moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and much of his life was there, and then moved to California, and then to Mexico as well. So he moved around quite a bit. He inherited a family business, and so his parents were not wealthy to start with, but by the time he was an adult, they had plenty of money. And then he used some of that money to buy some land in the U.S. South that had oil on it. And then he became fabulously wealthy. He transitioned in the mid-1960s. So he's a trans man. And with this money that he had, he decided to do some good, and he started a philanthropy called the Erickson Educational Foundation. One of the first things he did with the foundation was he got in touch with an organization that called themselves a homophile organization. This was a precursor to the terminology gay rights, and they started in the 1950s. This organization is called One Inc. And he supported them for about 20 years. So the amount of money that he put into them was about $200,000, which is a fair bit of money even today. But if you think back to this started in mid-1960s and went to the mid-1980s, it was really a lot of money in those days. And that support allowed One to survive and to morph. And today, one continues on as the One Archives in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California, which is the largest LGBTQ plus archives in the world. So that was an important contribution that he made. He also funded an important researcher by the name of Vern Bullough, $60,000, again, in the context of the time. This was a huge amount of money to put together a massive bibliography of homosexuality, which in the day included a section on transvestism and transsexualism. And this is a time long before the internet. So to put together a bibliography, to find everything that was written and to make it all accessible in one place was a huge task and a huge service. The Erickson Educational Foundation published a newsletter and a pamphlet series, both of which were very accessible in terms of being able to read them, also very accessible in that they were given away for free for the asking, and brought together information that was almost impossible to find anywhere else. Again, there's no internet. There was not that much written on trans topics at the time anyway, and what was written was usually in medical libraries or in obscure little articles in a newspaper somewhere. He brought it all together and made it available to people. These were so valuable to both trans people and to researchers that I know people today who 50 years later have still kept these items because they were so important to them that they couldn't bear to throw them out, and they come to the Transgender Archives. Part of what the Erickson Educational Foundation did was a lot of public education. So they had a speakers bureau that went all over the place to all manner of different places, from church basements to training of psychiatrists and psychologists to training of police officers, religious leaders. They appeared on radio, television. They made their own films in the day before video was not available. They even went so far as to create 105 definitions that they put into dictionary. One set of definitions they put into 105 dictionaries and encyclopedias. So they're literally defining what does it mean to be transvestite or transsexual. Those were the terms of the day. They supported grassroots organizations. They kept a referral list of doctors and lawyers and other service providers who would support trans people in their interest to transition, which again, getting that information, there were very few people who would do that. Finding them was really difficult, and all you had to do was call the office and they would send you the list. They also funded researchers. They funded Harry Benjamin. If anybody knows the history of trans folks, you'll know Harry Benjamin was a very important figure. The EF funded the first clinic to provide gender-affirming surgery in the U.S., and all the early researchers were funded by the Erickson Education Foundation. And then they also pulled together a series of symposia starting in 1969 that morphed into what was at first called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, is now known as the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the international association that brings together all the people who are engaged in improving the health and well-being of trans people. The next person I'd like to tell you about is Stormy DeLaverie. And Stormy DeLaverie was born in New Orleans in the U.S. To a white father and a black mother, and identified as a butch lesbian, and did not identify as trans, but did drag. And so I've included Stormy for that reason, and identified right to the end of her life as a very butch lesbian, lived in New York City through most of her later years, and was actually a prominent figure in New York up until the time of her death. Now, between 1955 and 1969, Stormy was part of a black theater circuit troupe that was called the Jewel Box Revue. They were a drag revue that toured all over North America, and they were North America's first racially integrated drag revue. And Stormy's role was interesting because the way they advertised their show was that they were a drag revue with 25 men and 1 woman. And the challenge for the audience was always to pick out which one was the one woman. And of course, the one woman was Stormy. who was the MC, and nobody ever picked out Stormy as the one woman. And Stormy, as you can see in this picture, which is by a famous photographer, some of you may know, Diane Arbus, Stormy always dressed quite well dressed and formally dressed. And this was, in her day, not common for lesbian women. The other reason Stormy is a really important figure is from Stonewall. And most of you will know that Stonewall happened in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York City, and many people mark this as the beginning of gay rights, because what happened was that the gay bars were illegal and were owned by the mafia, and the mafia had to pay off the police, and every now and again the police would come in and raid. And they came in to raid the Stonewall, and usually what happened is they dragged people away, and it was a police raid. But in this one time, the people in the bar fought back. And it went on for days and days, and included the police having to barricade themselves in the bar because they were scared of the people outside. And it's often called the Stonewall Riots. And there's a lot of debate about who was there and who started it. But there seems to be quite a high level of agreement that Stormy was the one that threw the first punch, punched a police officer and resisted arrest. So this is the person who started Stonewall, and there doesn't seem to be much debate about that particular piece of the story. Now, I just want to close with what Stormy said about it. This is a quote. "It was a rebellion. It was an uprising. It was a civil rights disobedience. It wasn't no damn riot."
It begs the understanding of what's the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, if you could elaborate on that.
Right, okay. Always good questions, Claudia. Okay, so let's start with gender identity and sexual orientation, and then go to gender expression. So there's a little catchy phrase that often makes it easy for people to understand. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender identity is who you go to bed as. So gender identity is, this is who I am, and gender identities can be a whole range, as we've already been talking about, and there's no necessary correspondence between a particular gender identity and who a person might be attracted to or want to have a sexual or romantic relationship with. So the sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to, who you get involved with. When we're talking about trans people, I'd like to point out that generally trans people's sexual orientation, what they identify as their sexual orientation, is based on their gender identity, not on their genitals. So going back to an earlier question, not everybody has genital surgery. And so there is a tendency among some people who are less well informed to think that the sexual orientation should be decided on what parts they have and where they're putting them and who they're sharing them with. But in fact, it's more about gender identity. And so gender expression is how you show your gender to other people. And so in Stormy's case, for instance, Stormy was expressing their gender identity as a butch lesbian by wearing very masculine clothing, having a masculine haircut, and presumably having a lot of masculine mannerisms. But I have to point out that not everybody has the luxury of feeling comfortable or free or able to express their gender identity. And so you don't necessarily know someone's gender identity by what their gender expression is. So you may see somebody whose gender expression you read as, this is a man, and they may well have a gender identity as a woman or non-binary or something else, and because of the circumstances of their lives, they may not be able to feel able to express that, or they may express that in a way that you don't understand. And so we have, for instance, a lot of confusion with people who are non-binary and have a gender expression that's not clear. Other people get very uncomfortable and they try and pigeonhole them into a binary gender identity or gender. But really, gender expression, people would like it to match, but not everybody's able to do that.
Yeah, and this might be a bit of a personal opinion question, but do you have any recommendations on how to navigate that socially if we are unsure or whenever we run into those kinds of social interactions?
I think that, again, good question. I think that it's just to ask politely and respectfully, what pronouns do you use? or how should I address you, or what gender do you identify as? You can avoid completely offending somebody, because if somebody feels they're perfectly obvious and you ask them that question, they might be offended. So one of the ways to mitigate that a little bit is to start with presenting your own information. So just for the ease of conversation, I'd like you to understand that I identify as a man and I use he, him pronouns. What about you? Mm-hmm. Right? So you don't single them out as you need to tell me yours, but I don't need to tell you mine. Mm-hmm. So that alleviates it a little bit. It makes it seem more like, okay, we're just doing this because we do this with everybody. But best to ask if you're not sure. On this slide, you see Marsha P. Johnson on the left and Sylvia Rivera on the right. Both of these folks identified themselves as drag queens. Occasionally they call themselves gay men. Sometimes they use pronouns he, sometimes more often they use pronouns she. So somewhat fluid. I'm going to start with Marsha P. Johnson. Now, lots of people ask, what does the P stand for? And Marsha liked to say it stands for pay it no mind. So Marsha was an original member of the Gay Liberation Front, which started right after Stonewall. She was present at the Stonewall Rebellion. It's commonly said that both of them were there. Marsha is on record. You can find it online if you're interested, in her own voice being interviewed, saying that she was not there when it started. She came down about an hour later and she called Sylvia and said, Sylvia, there's something important happening downtown. Let's go. But Sylvia never showed up. They're both associated with Stonewall because of various statements that have made by them and by other people. But this is what Marsha had to say about their appearance. So Marsha was there, and she was active with Sylvia. They started an important organization called the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, known as STAR. And they founded that in 1970, so just a year after, not even a year after Stonewall. It was a radical political collective. It provided housing and support to homeless, queer youth, and sex workers in Lower Manhattan. So the kids who were the most out of luck, needing of help, who had nowhere to go and no resources, they took them in, gave them a home, fed them. And they largely funded the organization through sex work, their own and others. So they were real grassroots activists. Marsha P. Johnson was known as the mayor of Christopher Street. And so you'll notice, Mayor and Christopher Street is where Stonewall Inn, that's the street that the Stonewall Inn was on. Marsha P. Johnson died under suspicious circumstances, and there's a movement now to try and resolve that even this day, and that's since 1992. Sylvia Rivera was Latina, and she was radical till the end. She's among other things, she's known for getting up at one of what was then called Christopher Street rallies after the Stonewall being on Christopher Street, which was now the Gay Pride rallies. In 1973, she demanded time on the stage and started a speech with "Y'all better quiet down." It's kind of well known for that. And then she went on to chastise middle-class white gay men for basically turning their backs on, street level drag queens who were not middle class, didn't have a lot of money, weren't fancy, and being embarrassed by them because they were trying to get rights for middle class types. And she gave them a hard time about that, and that was great. She is commemorated by the corner of Christopher and Hudson Streets, is now named Sylvia Rivera Way. And there's a Sylvia Rivera Law Project named for her as well.
Great question from the audience members here. Can you speak to the differences or overlaps between drag and trans?
Sure, also a great question. So there's a historical component to my answer. So if we go back to the time that Sylvia and Marsha were first active in the 70s, very few people who were involved in the gay community and did drag would call themselves trans, unless they decided to start taking hormones, and even then they would often still call themselves drag queens. So unless they actually went for surgery, they didn't start to call themselves trans, because at that time, transsexual meant genital surgery, and there wasn't the kind of transgender range and diversity that we have today, because the word transgender really wasn't in common usage until the mid-1990s. So in those earlier days, drag was largely a gay phenomenon and gay identity. But nowadays, people who do drag often think of themselves as trans, even if they're not interested at all in hormones or interested in surgeries. They might also think of themselves as non-binary. So the term transgender, or trans as a more even more generic term than transgender, has blurred a lot of distinctions that were stronger at another time. An interesting story, there was a very famous drag artist named, her drag name was Flawless Sabrina, and there was a very famous video about her made in the 60s called The Queen. And I met Flawless a few years before she died. She's gone now. And at that point, she did identify herself as trans, because the world around her has changed and the vocabulary around her has changed, and she had opportunities that she didn't have before. So Flawless became trans, but she wasn't in the early days.
Awesome. Another question from the audience member here. Could you explain more, what does it mean if a person prefers to be referred to as they instead of he or she?
Sure. So they goes generally with people who identify as non-binary. But we see more and more people who don't necessarily identify as non-binary taking that up as a kind of solidarity with people who are gender diverse. And so if you do not identify in the binary, if you don't identify as a man or a woman, then the he and she pronouns are not a good reflection of who you are. And so people have taken up, there have been a lot of other kinds of pronouns that were floated around since about 2000 or so, maybe a little before that. But we seem to be settling into they being the most common version of a gender neutral pronoun. And if you think about it, people use that all the time in their everyday language when they are referring generically to somebody else. So they're going to come to my house. You don't necessarily know who they are. Because there's a bunch of people coming, and we use it in a generic way. And so now the effort is to try and get people to use it as a singular instead of he and she. And so there's a certain resistance from people who have their grammar drilled into them to doing that, because they is supposed to be plural. But I will point out that it's not that long ago in the history of the English language that we had a singular you. Right now, we're very accustomed to using you for both singular and plural and figuring out from the context what we mean by that. And if you think about it, you may be able to answer the question of what was the singular you, but I'll do it for you. We used to say thou, and I even used to say thee. And if you say that now, people think that you're very strange. And I don't think it's too far off in the future that we'll be quite accustomed to using they in the singular and the plural, just like we use you in the singular and the plural. Okay, the next individual I'd like to talk about for a couple of minutes is Rupert Raj. Rupert is still with us, as you can see from the dates up at the top. He's Canadian, trans man who transitioned in 1971. His father is Polish and his mother is South Asian. Rupert was one of the early activists in Canadian trans rights. In 1978, he started an organization called the Foundation for the Advancement of Canadian Transsexuals, also known as FACT. And they had a newsletter called the Gender Review, or a factual journal. Didn't last all that long, but it was one of the first. And then 82 to 88, he had a bi-monthly magazine for trans men, that's every 2 months, called Metamorphosis. And after that amount of work, he entered a period that he describes in his memoirs as a burnout or recovery period from 88 to 99. But 99, he came back. He began a support group in Toronto called Trans Men, or the FTM Peer Support Group. FTM stands for female to male, and it was in use then. Most people consider that not the best way to describe trans men today. and he was an active in Toronto as a psychotherapist, a gender specialist, and a trans-positive professional trainer until his retirement in 2015. He spoke had him in to the Moving Trans History Forward conference in 2016 as a speaker on one of our feature events, which is an elders panel. So we had him in as an elder in 2016, and he retired to Vancouver. So he is local to Vancouver.
We do have a question from the audience here from a few minutes ago. How or where does sex work intersect with the trans and LGBTQI plus movement? Any thoughts on why?
Yes, and actually, I'd like to ask you to just hold that question until the next slide, because the next slide is about someone who was a trans woman and very active in the sex work community. So can I ask you to bring me that question back after that slide?
For sure. Great teaser.
Oh, I put her up on the screen, Jamie Lee Hamilton, and you can see she died just recently. Jamie Lee was a friend of mine for like 20 years, and I miss her dearly. She's a trans woman who is from Vancouver, born and raised, grew up in the downtown East Side. Her dad was Irish, and her mother was Chippewa Cree, and Jamie Lee comes from a history of activism because her mom was one of the people who started the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center in Vancouver in 1954. So she's got a good lineage in that regard. In 1970, at age 15, she was the first youth in Canada to start medical transition. By the 1980s, she became a public figure because she was making her living as a sex worker. And the sex workers were congregated in the West End of Vancouver, and due to community activism, they were forced out of the West End and into part of Vancouver that was much more dangerous for them. And Jamie Lee became an activist opposing that forced movement out of the West End into the downtown East Side, where things became much more dangerous. In 1998, she became somewhat famous in relation to that because she was one of the first people to raise the alarm that women sex workers, including many trans women sex workers, were disappearing from the downtown East Side in what eventually became understood to be the work of Willie Pickton, who murdered a horrible story. I'm not going to go into it. Murdered many, many women. Jamie Lee went to the City Hall in Vancouver and dumped 67 pairs of stiletto heels on the steps of City Hall, representing 67 women who were missing from the downtown East Side. She also became well known because she ran for Vancouver City Council in 1996, and she was the first openly trans candidate to seek public office anywhere in Canada. She was not elected. She also ran for the Vancouver Board of Education, specifically to oppose shutting down East Side schools that had significant Indigenous enrollment. She spoke at again on the Elders panel at the Moving Trans History Forward conference in 2018, and as I mentioned before, unfortunately we lost her in 2019 due to cancer. So they say she was involved in sex work. I'm now going to try and answer your question, Claudia, or the audience members' question. What we see, unfortunately, is that there's a lot of trans women who are unable to gain any kind of livelihood that is legal. There's a huge amount of discrimination against trans women, and it starts very, very young. So for anyone who is obviously very gender nonconforming, if you are a assigned male at birth person who is very obviously feminine and cannot conform or will not conform, but really it's cannot conform to what is expected of boys, you have a lot of trouble in school, you get bullied, you're likely to have substance abuse problems, you may very well drop out of school and not have adequate education. And if you persist into, early adulthood and you are dressing like a woman, looking like a woman, but people can recognize that you're a male because you don't have the resources, the middle class resources to make yourself look like what people expect you to look like. You can't get a job where anybody will pay you any kind of living wage. And so a lot of people, a lot of trans women who come from that kind of background find that the only way they can make a living, a decent living, and if they want to get surgery, the only way they can get enough money together to get the surgery, if they want to have hormones, the only way they can get enough money together to get the hormones, if they want to look good, the only way they can get enough money together for wigs or clothing or makeup and all the accoutrements that you need is sex work. And lots of people will leave sex work once they are able to get a job that will pay them a living wage. But to get to that point, a lot of trans women find themselves that's really their only survival option.
It's very interesting to learn more and really think about the social economical circumstance of the individual and the typical circumstances of from start to finish the whole process and the reasons why certain areas intersect there.
You do also see some trans men working in sex work, but not as frequently. The pattern that I described is not as harsh in growing up. So there's more social latitude for people assigned female at birth to present themselves, a gender expression, to have a masculine gender expression, and fewer barriers to less bullying, less abuse, less dropping out of school. Now, all of those things happen. I'm not saying they don't happen to transmasculine individuals. They absolutely do, but it's a matter of degree. And so when it happens to them and they are not able to make a living, you see also transmasculine people going into sex work. But you don't see it as often as you do with trans women because the abuse and the damage to the ability to make a decent living is much more severe against people who are assigned male at birth and whose gender expression is very feminine. This next picture is a participant at Fantasia Fair. I don't actually know what her name is. This is something from the files at the University of Victoria, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the Fantasia Fair and use this picture as a way into that. Fantasia Fair, we have quite a collection at the University of Victoria Transgender Archives about Fantasia Fair, and it is the longest running trans plus gathering anywhere in the Western world. So this is a gathering, it's about a week long. It's kind of a retreat. It started largely for middle-class, white, male, heterosexual crossdressers and has since expanded its range. There's still the limitation of cost, but there are scholarships. So there is some relief in that regard. So it's a week long. It takes place in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Some of you will know that as a very gay community. Although the folks that come to this do not generally identify as gay, but it is a hospitable location. And this has happened every fall since 1974. This year, it didn't happen because of COVID. So that's the first time that Fantasia Fair has not taken place since in 46 years. So that's quite remarkable that there is this ongoing haven for trans people to have a week away together in Provincetown every year for 46 years. The last person that I want to tell you about, and you know the old expression, certainly not the least, is Ayanna Marikel. And you can see from this picture that Ayanna was just a delightful person. Unfortunately, we have lost her as well. Ayanna described herself as a two-spirit, transformed woman who loves women. So Ayanna would identify herself as a lesbian because she is a woman who loves women. She's two-spirit, and I'd like to take a moment to say a little bit about what two-spirit means, because it's something a lot of people don't quite understand. So two-spirit is a term that was shared by an elder named Myra Laramie in 1990 at the 3rd Annual International LGBT Native American Gathering. And it took place in Winnipeg, in Canada. So this term was adopted in 1990 by this gathering, and it came up because, as some of you will know, the indigenous people of North America did not generally have the same kind of binary conception of gender that we have in Western European-based cultures. And each of the many, many languages and cultures across North America had their own nuanced meaning and expression and words for the different third and fourth and fifth different genders that existed in their cultures. And somehow people needed to be able to speak to each other and to understand each other and to have some kind of common language. And so English was the common language, and what they came up with in English was this term Two-Spirit. And Two-Spirit is a kind of umbrella term that's used by different people in different ways. And as I said before, the different cultures have their own words that have their own nuance, different kinds of meanings, and different cultural locations. But Two-Spirit as an umbrella term really means everything in that spectrum of LGBTQ, and of course, two for Two-Spirit, and many other terms. And so really what it means is anyone who is not heterosexual gender conforming. And within that, some people also identify as lesbian or gay or queer or trans or non-binary or any number of other identities. And some people simply say, I am Two-Spirit. And you can't divide me up and pigeonhole me any further than that. So Two-Spirit is this overarching general term. It should only be used by Indigenous people, and it can have a lot of different meanings. So coming back to some of our earlier discussion, it can be about gender identity, it can be about gender expression, it can be about sexual orientation, or it can simply be stand on its own. It is any and all of the above, and they morph and blend in different ways in different people, and Two-Spirit is just the way a person identifies. So Ayanna's work was very much geared towards teaching people a decolonized understanding of gender and sexuality that was about these Indigenous traditions that fall outside of the gender binary. She was a performance artist, a visual artist, and an author, and she was from the Six Nations in Ontario. I invited her to speak also on the Elders panel at the 2016 Moving Trans History Forward conference. She really wanted to come. We tried to do everything we could to make it possible for her to come, including to bring her in virtually. But she just was not well enough. She had cancer, and in fact, she died not very long after that. And she has bequeathed her archives of her life and her work to the Transgender Archives, and we're very proud to have been the recipient of that gift.
It's really, really great to hear and see two Indigenous women's stories represented here. It's really enlightening and eye-opening to learn about the role that Indigenous voices have played in the trans movement, Erin. Thank you for sharing with that.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to just finish up then with a couple of things about us. So I said before I would point out to you that we're active on social media, and I invite you to connect with us. We're on Facebook. We have really a big YouTube library. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. We have a newsletter. Obviously, we have web pages. There's web pages for the Trans Chair, which is what I have up there. There's also a separate web page for the Transgender Archives and a separate web page for the Moving Trans History Forward. But you can link to all of those through the Trans Chair website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Erin. Before I give your thanks right back at you, we can jump into a quick Q&A portion. I know we don't have too much time left, but we did get a question from the audience here, which might be something really, reading the question might be really something for the tech community all up to address and discuss, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So the question from the audience is, how can we make tech career paths more trans-friendly and inviting? Are there ways we can increase and or build a pipeline for trans youth to help get into tech? Are there stereotypes within the trans and LGBTQI plus community about tech not being inclusive for them?
Great question. And I will say that it's my observation, I don't have a lot of science behind this, but it's my observation that trans people are early adopters of tech, or at least the internet, and have been very active in online communities. I think partially because, there's an old joke that, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. And that translates into, on the internet, nobody knows whether you're male or female or human or an animal or what you are, and you can be who you want to be on the internet. So I think there's a lot of interest in the trans community. In terms of what tech can do, I think it's the same thing that anybody can do, is to make statements clearly and loudly that you are interested in including trans people. Because the experience of most trans people is that you never know who your friends are going to be and who it's going to be safe to talk to and to be around unless they tell you. And you go into it with a certain amount of trepidation in every situation until you know. And so small things like putting the trans flag onto public information, including the words gender identity and gender expression. For instance, when we advertise at UVic, we say people of all genders are encouraged to apply, and that we want to increase the diversity in what we do. Educate yourselves, speak out, and make it known that this is something that is that you want to be doing.
Thank you, Aaron. And on that note, especially with all the amazing questions that we got today, it seems like we're hearing the term transgender quite frequently now between media, communication, and just social interactions. Why does it seem like there's so many more conversations about transgender people happening all of a sudden? Right.
So trans people have always been around, have always been part of society. As long as there have been humans, there have been trans people. They didn't call themselves trans. They didn't have the same meaning, but we've always been here. But what's happening today, I think, actually has a lot to do with the internet. And so when I said before, trans people are 1 or 2% of society, that's not very many people in any geographic location. And I mentioned before that you can't always tell who's trans. And so for trans people to find each other and to make themselves known has not been easy, even to find themselves and make themselves known to each other. And then we have the danger of making yourselves known to other people. And so first you have to find each other. And when the internet came into everybody's homes, it allowed people who were geographically dispersed to connect and to start to form coalitions and to organize. So we started to see a real uptick in transgender organizing in the mid-90s when the internet became more commonly available to the public. Then when we reached the point where we started to have an interactive internet, and some people call it Web 2, then we started to see that trans people could actually take some control over what was said about them. And so then we started to hear a whole lot more from trans people because they could go online and could publish their own material and their own information about themselves. So we see 1 million YouTubes, for instance, lots. And if you go and search on the internet about trans people today, an awful lot of what you find is written by trans people. And so trans people start to make themselves more visible by saying, we're telling our own stories. We don't want other people telling stories about us because they're not accurate. And then in the mid-2000s, we started to see laws change. And it wasn't until mid-20-teens, we started to see the laws change in Canada to give human rights protections to trans people. So even more trans people felt enabled to come forward to claim their place in society and to claim their rights because they now actually had those rights. Because up until that point, there was no legal protections for trans people. And that's very recent. That's, like the last 5 years or so. So we've seen increasingly more and more trans people being willing, trans non-binary, two-spirit, trans plus people being willing to come forward and feel able to make their own case for who they are and to make those claims. And as all of that happens, we've seen more acceptance growing in society. And we've seen more people who react well to those claims and are supportive. And so it snowballs and it builds.
Thank you, Aaron. A lot of great questions coming in here. Thank you, everyone, for submitting. We might not have time for all of them, but we'll try our best to get through as many as possible. Can you share your thoughts on the intersection of race and trans, especially in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement? We've started to see more in the mainstream images of trans women who have been murdered.
There's two parts to that question. So there's a commemorative event that happens every year called Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a commemoration for all the trans people who have been murdered on the basis of their gender over the last year. And unfortunately, what we see internationally is a much higher proportion of trans women, and in particular trans women of color, than are representative of what their proportion is in society at large. There is intersection of race and gender means that we have a compounding effect, not simple additive, but a compounding effect of discrimination and disadvantage that we see among trans women of color. That means that they are more likely to be those people who do not get the jobs, who do not get the education, who are discriminated against, who are on the receiving end of violence and abuse. And, this is true for trans women, it's true for trans people, it's true for people of color. And then when you put it together, we see a compounding effect. And so the experiences of many trans women are, significantly much more difficult lives than we see for middle-class white folks who happen to be trans as well.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Aaron. Another question from the audience member here. For young adult trans women looking for a job, if they just started the transition, what advice would you give them in their job hunt? Wait until the transition is complete or start looking right away?
That's a very tough question. The job market is improving. The legal protections are there. Many of the bigger corporations actually have policies that are aimed at making it possible for people to transition on the job, supporting it, having healthcare coverage. But what you see in policy and what you see in practice is often a big gap. And so you can have all manner of laws, you can have all manner of policies, and if people who are charged with putting those things into practice are not well educated or not well meaning, your life can be miserable. And so the most difficult time for anyone who is transitioning in a binary way, I think that was what was behind that question. The most difficult time is that in-between stage where who you are and how you look and what your gender expression looks like to other people is changing on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. Your average member of society understands binary gender. They do not understand the transition between binary genders, and they have a very hard time with non-binary genders. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody financially is able to wait until they have a gender expression that other people understand better, well, great, but most people don't have that option. And so the next thing I would suggest is see if you can if you have the opportunity to get into one of the larger companies or corporations or government offices that actually have policies, and go to people in the human resources area and make sure they understand who you are and that they're prepared to protect you and support you in your transition.
Thank you, Aaron. And another question from the audience member here. It seems that the stigmas unique to trans feminism are rooted in the same issues feminists confront or combat. Are there groups that converge towards these issues? Are there ways to prevent exclusion?
So, also great questions. So, there's actually a term called transmisogyny. So misogyny is a hatred of women or discrimination against women, and then transmisogyny is the idea that there's an extra compounding effect there as well. So our society, feminists have been pointing out for a long time, has a low opinion of women, but more specifically a low opinion of what transmisogyny is talking about is a low opinion of femininity. And so there is a compounding effect where you have someone who is perceived as trans and is perceived as casting aside their male privilege. Well, lots of people think, well, that must be crazy. And then being feminine and being perceived as being feminine in a way that's artificial. But again, the misogyny would say all femininity is somewhat artificial, and being criticized for doing things that cisgender women do all the time. So, dressing in wearing a dress, doing something nice with their hair, wearing makeup and jewelry, and all of a sudden that's even worse on a trans woman than it is on a cisgender woman. Cisgender meaning non-trans. So there is this whole concept that does try and bring it together, and I would recommend the work of an author named Julia Serano, Serano. When we were going to have a live conference in 2020, she was going to be our Saturday night keynote speaker, but unfortunately that couldn't happen because of COVID. But she talks a lot about the intersection of misogyny and discrimination against trans women in particular, and talks a lot about trans misogyny in a very accessible, easy to read and easy to understand, and easy to digest in a way.
Any of the remaining questions here, I urge you to continue the conversation offline and research and continue to educate there. And of course, Erin has left contact information and ways to connect with the organization as well. And thank you, Erin, for taking the time to be here today and to share your depth of knowledge with us. Conversations like this are really integral to raising awareness, educating and deepening the understanding for our communities locally and around the world. We hope to leave you today feeling empowered to keep on learning and keep on having these conversations and carrying out everything you've learned today in your daily lives. Thank you, everyone.